The air in the trauma bay of Metropolitan General Hospital was a constant low-grade hum of controlled chaos, a symphony of beeping monitors, the hiss of oxygen, and the clipped professional jargon of people who lived on the knife's edge of life and death. It was an environment that stripped away pretense, leaving only skill and nerve. And in this world, Nurse Ilara Vance moved like a ghost, a quiet, efficient presence that seemed to absorb the surrounding panic and transmute it into calm action. Her movements were economical, precise, each step and gesture honed by a discipline that felt deeper and older than her 34 years. Her face, usually a mask of serene neutrality, was framed by dark hair pulled back into a severe, functional bun, revealing nothing of the storms that had weathered her past. Her colleagues respected her competence, a grudging admiration for the woman who could insert an 18-gauge IV into a collapsing vein in a moving ambulance gurney, or titrate a norepinephrine drip with the focus of a bomb disposal expert. Yet, they knew almost nothing about her. She spoke little of her life outside the hospital's sterile walls, offering only placid smiles and non-committal answers to personal questions. Her stillness was often mistaken for shyness, her reserve for a lack of ambition. They saw the nurse, the capable hands, the calm voice in a crisis, but they did not see the woman behind the surgical mask. They saw her only as the sum of her most visible parts, and the most visible parts of Ilara Vance, besides her cool grey eyes, were her scars. They were not small, demure imperfections that could be easily concealed or dismissed. One was a thick silvered rope of keloid tissue that snaked down her left forearm, starting just below the elbow and disappearing into the cuff of her scrubs. It was a jagged, angry-looking mark, a permanent lightning strike etched into her skin. The other was a starburst of puckered flesh just above her right clavicle, a pale, intricate web that peeked out from the V-neck of her uniform. When asked, on the rare occasion someone was bold enough to inquire, she would offer a quiet, deflective explanation. "A car accident," she would murmur, her eyes distant for just a moment. "A long time ago." The explanation was accepted because it was simple, because it fit the narrative of a quiet nurse who had survived a mundane tragedy. It was a convenient fiction that kept the wolves of curiosity from her door. But on certain days, when the pressure in the ER dropped and a quiet moment allowed for introspection, she would unconsciously trace the raised line on her arm. The texture was as familiar as her own heartbeat. It was not the memory of twisted metal and shattering glass that came to her, but the acrid smell of cordite and diesel fuel, the deafening rattle of a heavy machine gun, and the specific, gut-wrenching sensation of a superheated piece of metal tearing through flesh and muscle. The scar was not a souvenir from a highway collision. It was a cartographical record of a firefight in a valley whose name was unpronounceable to most and unforgettable to the few who had survived it. The starburst on her collarbone was not from a shattered windshield. It was a map of a moment when the world had dissolved into fire and thunder, a constellation of pain left by the shrapnel of a device designed to erase human beings from existence. These were truths she had buried deep, secrets locked away behind the placid facade of Nurse Vance. Her hidden past would sometimes bleed through in small, almost imperceptible ways. During a particularly chaotic code blue, when a young intern fumbled with a defibrillator paddle, Ilara's hand had shot out, her voice cutting through the noise with an authority that was utterly alien to her usual soft-spoken demeanor. "Charge to 200. Clear!" Her command was so absolute, so instinctual, that everyone, including the attending physician, had simply obeyed without thought. Afterwards, they had attributed it to the adrenaline of the moment, a fluke. They did not recognize the ingrained cadence of a combat leader. On another occasion, a police officer brought in with a gunshot wound had his service weapon clatter to the floor. While others flinched, Ilara had moved with a fluid grace, scooping up the Glock, clearing the chamber, and making it safe with a series of practiced, efficient movements that spoke of thousands of hours of muscle memory. The officer, wide-eyed and bleeding, had simply stared. These moments were ripples on a still pond, quickly fading, leaving the surface of her carefully constructed identity undisturbed. This fragile piece, this carefully maintained anonymity, was about to be shattered by the arrival of Dr. Adrian Croft. He was the hospital's new chief of emergency medicine, a man who wore his ambition like a tailored suit, crisp and expensive. Croft had ascended the ranks not through exceptional diagnostic skill or a deep well of empathy, but through relentless networking, political maneuvering, and an unshakable belief in his own superiority. He saw the emergency department not as a place of healing, but as a fiefdom, and its staff as subjects who existed to reflect his own brilliance. He was a man who confused arrogance with authority, a man who measured the worth of others by their titles and their willingness to defer to him. His gaze fell upon Ilara Vance during his first official morning rounds, and he saw not a highly competent trauma nurse, but a subordinate, a woman whose quiet presence he interpreted as weakness. He saw the scars, and in them he saw an imperfection, a flaw in the otherwise pristine machine he now commanded. He saw an opportunity to assert his dominance, to make an example, to show everyone who was in charge. He walked with a coterie of nervous interns and residents, a small flock trailing in the wake of his self-importance. They stopped at the central nursing station where Ilara was meticulously documenting patient vitals in a chart. Croft picked up the chart, glancing at it with performative disdain before his eyes landed on Ilara's exposed forearm. A cruel, condescending smirk spread across his lips. He saw the interns watching him, waiting for their cue. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the jagged silver scar. "Quite the souvenir from a fender bender, Nurse Vance," he announced, his voice loud enough for the entire station to hear. "You must have been driving a clown car to get a gash like that." He chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. A few of the interns, eager to curry favor with their new chief, let out sycophantic little laughs. The other nurses shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Croft's smug face and Ilara's impassive one. The air grew thick with a toxic mixture of embarrassment and second-hand humiliation. It was a petty cruelty, a playground bully's taunt delivered by a man in a pristine white coat. He was poking the bear, entirely unaware that he was standing in front of a grizzly. Ilara did not flinch. She did not blush or look away. She simply lifted her gaze from the chart and met his eyes. Her own were as calm and flat as a frozen lake. Inside, a familiar cold stillness settled over her. She had heard worse under direct fire. She had been called things far more profane by men who were actively trying to kill her. The petty barbs of this preening surgeon were like stones thrown against the armored hull of a battleship. They made a noise, but they left no mark. She simply held his gaze for a beat, a silent challenge that he was too arrogant to even recognize, before she lowered her eyes back to her work, her pen continuing its steady, neat script across the page. Her silence was a dismissal more profound than any retort. Her lack of reaction infuriated Croft more than any outburst could have. He had expected tears or a flustered defense, or at the very least a frightened submission. He had gotten nothing. He saw her composure not as strength, but as insolence. In his mind, she had defied him. He slammed the chart down on the counter, the sharp crack echoing in the suddenly silent bay. "When I am speaking to you, nurse, you will have the courtesy to respond," he hissed, his voice dropping to a low, menacing register. Before Ilara could formulate a response that would not result in her immediate termination, the overhead speaker crackled to life, a disembodied voice severing the tension. "Code trauma, air med inbound, ETA 5 minutes, single patient, GSW, multiple traumatic injuries, military personnel, high priority." The announcement was a bucket of cold water on the smoldering confrontation. Instantly, the professional masks snapped back into place. The team scattered, preparing Trauma Bay 1 for the incoming patient. Croft, his face still tight with anger, straightened his coat and marched toward the bay, eager to reassert his authority in a domain he understood. Medicine, not the unreadable quiet of a subordinate who refused to break. Ilara, her face betraying nothing, simply placed the pen down, closed the chart, and moved toward the bay, her stride smooth and purposeful. The storm had passed for now. Dr. Croft, however, was not a man to let a perceived slight go unanswered. Later that afternoon, after the morning's trauma had been stabilized and sent to the operating room, he summoned Ilara to his new glass-walled office. It was a sterile, impersonal space that overlooked the ambulance bay, filled with expensive, modern furniture and framed copies of his many diplomas and awards. He sat behind a large mahogany desk, steepling his fingers, the very picture of condescending authority. He did not invite her to sit. "Nurse Vance," he began, his tone dripping with false concern. "I am worried about the image we project here in the emergency department. We are the face of Metropolitan General, the first impression for many of our patients. It is paramount that we project an image of pristine professionalism." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Your visible scarring is, to be frank, somewhat unsettling. It lacks a certain polish. We have patients, particularly children, who could find it distressing." Elara stood perfectly still, her hands clasped loosely behind her back. She recognized the strategy immediately. It was a classic administrative attack, flanking her with policy and procedure where a direct assault had failed. He was trying to frame his personal animosity as a professional concern. "I have never had a patient complain, Dr. Croft," she stated, her voice even and low. "That is not the point," he snapped, his facade of concern crumbling into irritation. "The point is the standard I am setting. I have reviewed your file. Your performance reviews are adequate, but this is a top-tier institution. Adequate is not enough." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "I am placing a formal letter in your file regarding your unprofessional appearance. I would strongly suggest you look into cosmetic options for covering your condition, or perhaps a transfer to a less public-facing department like records or billing might be more suitable for you. Consider this your only warning." It was a clear, unambiguous threat. He was trying to force her out, to erase the quiet, unflinching woman who had refused to be his victim. Elara felt a cold, hard knot form in her stomach. For years she had sought refuge in the anonymity of this life, a quiet penance for a past filled with noise and violence. She had found a measure of peace in the simple, noble act of saving lives without a weapon in her hand. Now this petty tyrant was threatening to take it away, all because of his own wounded pride. She gave a single sharp nod. "I understand, Doctor," she said, her voice betraying no emotion. She turned and walked out of the office, the glass door clicking shut behind her, leaving Croft with a smug, satisfied smile on his face. He believed he had won. The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine and simmering tension. Elara moved through her tasks with her usual efficiency, but there was a new rigidity in her posture, a guardedness in her eyes. She felt cornered, the walls of her carefully constructed sanctuary closing in. She was contemplating her options: resignation, a formal complaint that would go nowhere against a department chief, a transfer to the sterile anonymity of the hospital's basement archives, when the world exploded again. The piercing tone of the emergency alert system blared through the department, followed by the same clipped voice from the morning. But this time, it was laced with an urgency that made the hairs on Elara's arms stand up. Mass casualty incident declared, training accident at Fort Braddock, AirMed inbound multiple helicopters, first bird, call sign Nightingale 1, ETA 2 minutes, single patient, critical, designate Alpha 1. I repeat, this is an Alpha 1 priority. Alpha 1. The designation was reserved for the highest ranking and most critical patients, generals, politicians, foreign dignitaries. It meant the full weight of the hospital's resources would be brought to bear. An expectant hush fell over the ER, the typical background noise replaced by the focused energy of preparation. Dr. Croft emerged from his office, his face alight with a predatory excitement. This was his chance to shine, to manage a high-profile crisis and cement his status. He began barking orders, positioning his team like a general arranging toy soldiers, his earlier conflict with Elara seemingly forgotten in the face of this new, more important drama. The rhythmic hump, hump, hump of rotor blades grew from a distant thrum to a building-shaking roar. Through the large bay windows, Elara saw the sleek, olive-drab form of a Black Hawk helicopter descending toward the rooftop helipad, not the usual civilian medical transport. This was military. Her heart gave a painful thud against her ribs. She felt a phantom weight on her shoulders, the remembered pressure of a fully loaded plate carrier. The smell of jet fuel, faint at first, began to seep into the sterile, recycled air of the hospital, and with it came a flood of memories she fought daily to keep submerged. Moments later, the doors to the trauma bay burst open. A team of paramedics and military medics wheeled in a gurney at a dead run. On it lay a man submerged in a nightmare of blood and medical equipment. His uniform was shredded and blackened, and he was hooked up to a portable ventilator that breathed for him with a rhythmic hiss. IV lines snaked from his arms, feeding him blood and fluids. Even through the chaos and the gore, the man on the gurney projected an aura of immense authority. He was broad-shouldered and powerfully built, his face a mask of chiseled granite, now pale and slick with sweat. "Colonel Marcus Thorne," one of the flight medics yelled over the din, "multiple GSWs to the chest and abdomen, shrapnel to the left leg, lost consciousness en route, BP is 60 over palp, heart rate 140 and thready. We've pushed 4 units of ONEG and started a dopamine drip." Dr. Croft stepped forward, puffing out his chest. "I am Dr. Croft, chief of this department. Bring him to Trauma 1. I will be leading the resuscitation." He radiated an oily confidence, seeing the decorated colonel not as a patient, but as a prize. As the team swarmed into the primary trauma room, maneuvering the gurney into position, the colonel's eyes fluttered open. They were cloudy with pain and shock, but they were scanning, searching, the ingrained habit of a soldier assessing a threat. His gaze passed over the frantic faces of the residents, over the arrogant visage of Dr. Croft, and then they locked onto Ilara, who was standing just inside the doorway, preparing a transfusion line. Recognition flickered in the depths of his eyes. A spark of disbelief, then dawning comprehension. His body was failing, but his mind, his will, was a fortress. He ripped the non-rebreather mask from his face, a raw, guttural gasp escaping his lips. His hand, shaking with effort, shot out and grabbed Ilara's arm, the one with the long, jagged scar. His grip was surprisingly strong, a desperate anchor in a sea of pain. "No," he rasped, his voice a shredded whisper that nonetheless commanded the attention of the entire room. All activity ceased. Everyone stared. He fixed his gaze on Croft, a look of pure, unadulterated loathing in his eyes. "Not you. Get him away from me." Then his eyes found Ilara's again, and a desperate plea entered his voice. "Vance, it's you. It has to be you. Only you." A stunned silence fell over Trauma Bay 1. Dr. Croft froze, his face a comical mask of confusion and outrage. "What is he talking about? He's delirious. Nurse, get out of the way," he commanded, reaching to push Ilara aside. But Ilara did not move. She was rooted to the spot, the colonel's grip on her scarred arm a physical link to a life she had tried to bury. Looking into his eyes, she did not see a patient. She saw Marcus Thorne. She saw the dust of Kandahar, the freezing mud of the Hindu Kush, the face of the commander who had once trusted her with his life and the lives of his men. In that moment, the placid, quiet shell of Nurse Vance cracked, and the person who had been forged in the crucible of war began to emerge. The mask was not just dropping, it was disintegrating. "He's not delirious," she said, and her voice was different. The soft, gentle cadence was gone, replaced by a hard, clear tone that sliced through the stunned silence. It was a voice accustomed to being obeyed without question in the middle of a firefight. She looked down at Colonel Thorne, her eyes performing a rapid, systematic assessment. His skin was clammy, his breathing shallow and rapid despite the ventilator, his neck veins distended. Her gaze was no longer that of a nurse. It was the cold, analytical scan of a special operations combat medic. "He's got a tension pneumothorax. His right lung is collapsed and it's shifting his mediastinum," she announced, her words sharp and precise. She looked at the nearest resident, a young man a moment ago in awe of Croft, now staring at her as if she had grown a second head. "Get me a 14-gauge angiocath now, and someone get a chest tube tray and a pleur evac. We need to get O-negative blood on a rapid infuser and activate the massive transfusion protocol. Now, move." Her commands were a thunderclap in the quiet room. Dr. Croft finally found his voice, sputtering with indignation. "Who in the hell do you think you are? I am in charge of this trauma. You are a nurse, security," he bellowed toward the door. Ilara ignored him completely. She took the large bore needle from the trembling hand of the resident. She ripped open the colonel's torn uniform, exposing his chest. Without a moment's hesitation, she located the second intercostal space in the mid-clavicular line, a landmark as familiar to her as the back of her own hand. There was no tremor in her fingers, no doubt in her eyes. This was her world. She had done this in the back of a bucking helicopter, in the dark, under fire, with nothing but a penlight between her teeth. A pristine, well-lit trauma bay was a luxury. She plunged the needle into his chest. There was a distinct audible hiss of escaping air as the pressure that was crushing his heart and lungs was released. The numbers on the cardiac monitor, which had been trending dangerously downward, immediately began to stabilize. The colonel let out a long, shuddering sigh of relief, his grip on her arm finally slackening. The entire room was frozen in a state of collective shock. The other nurses, the residents, even the hardened paramedics, stared at her with a mixture of awe and disbelief. They had all just witnessed a nurse perform a life-saving invasive procedure usually reserved for physicians, and she had done it with a speed, confidence, and authority that none of them, including Dr. Croft, possessed. She moved with the brutal, terrifying efficiency of a master craftsman at work. The quiet, unassuming nurse Vance had vanished, and in her place stood a warrior. She was not finished. "His abdomen is rigid," she barked, her hands already palpating the colonel's stomach. "He's bleeding internally, probably a splenic lac or a liver injury. We need a fast exam, but he doesn't have time for diagnostics. Get the OR on the line. Tell them we are coming up now. And page Dr. Evans," she said, naming the hospital's head of trauma surgery, a man Croft saw as his primary rival. "Tell him it's a Code Omega." Code Omega was a designation Ilara had just invented, but it had the desired effect of conveying ultimate urgency. Dr. Croft stood by, his face a pallid shade of grey. He had been rendered utterly irrelevant in his own trauma bay. He had called for security, but the two officers who had appeared at the door were now just watching the scene unfold, their expressions as stunned as everyone else's. Ilara was a whirlwind of controlled, violent purpose, directing the team, calling out for drugs, dosages, and equipment with a fluency that was breathtaking. She was not following protocols. She was creating them, adapting to the patient's needs with an instinct born of extreme experience. The room had become her operating theater, the staff her surgical team. They obeyed her without question, their hospital hierarchy forgotten, replaced by a more primal one. In the face of death, you follow the one who knows how to win. As the team prepared to move the now stabilized Colonel Thorne, he opened his eyes again. This time they were clearer, the fog of shock receding. He looked past Ilara to where Dr. Croft was standing, dumbfounded and impotent. A flicker of the colonel's old fire returned. His voice, though still weak, was now a low rumble that carried the weight of absolute command. It was the voice of a man who had led other men into the darkest places on earth. "That woman," he began, his voice drawing every eye in the room. He lifted a trembling, blood-caked finger and pointed directly at Ilara. "You see that woman? The one who just saved my life while you were calling for a security guard?" He paused, taking a ragged breath, his gaze boring into Croft. "Her name isn't Nurse Vance. Her name is Captain Vance, Captain Ilara Vance, and you will call her by her name." The title hung in the air, electric and impossible. Captain. The word recontextualized everything, the scars, the calm, the impossible skill. Dr. Croft's jaw worked silently, but no sound came out. The interns looked at Ilara as if she were a mythological creature. She was no longer just a nurse. She was a mystery, a hero hiding in plain sight. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, it had been utterly and irrevocably inverted. With Ilara at his side, monitoring his vitals, they began to wheel Colonel Thorne towards the large service elevators that led to the operating suites. The entire emergency department staff seemed to part before them, a silent, respectful corridor of stunned faces. As they waited for the elevator, the hospital administrator, Mr. Harris, a portly man in a rumpled suit who had been alerted to the Alpha 1 arrival, came scurrying up to them, his face a mask of anxiety. He had witnessed the last few minutes of the drama from the nursing station. "Dr. Croft," Harris began, looking at the chief with a new critical eye, "what in God's name just happened here? The colonel is refusing care from you." Before Croft could stammer out a defense, Colonel Thorne spoke again. His voice was stronger now, fueled by indignation and the will to see justice done. He looked from Croft's ashen face to the curious gaze of the administrator, and then at the small crowd of nurses and doctors that had gathered. He decided to make this a lesson. He decided to make this a reckoning. He gestured with his chin toward Ilara's left forearm, the one Croft had mocked just hours earlier. "You see this scar, Mr. Harris?" Thorne's voice was a low, powerful rasp. Dr. Croft here thought it was from a fender bender. He made a joke about it this morning in front of her colleagues. A collective gasp went through the small audience. Croft looked as if he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. "That fender bender," the colonel continued, his voice ringing with cold fury, "was a 7.62 millimeter round from a PKM machine gun that tore through the armored door of a Humvee in the Korangal Valley. It shattered the bone in her arm, but she didn't even cry out. She didn't stop. She kept returning fire with her service rifle, one-handed, while using her other hand to keep pressure on the femoral artery of a wounded medic lying next to her. That scar is the reason Sergeant First Class David Miller is alive today to see his children grow up." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The room was so quiet that the hum of the fluorescent lights sounded like a roar. He then shifted his gaze, indicating the starburst of tissue on her collarbone. "And this one," he said, his voice softening with a deep, profound respect. "The one that I'm sure also fails to meet Dr. Croft's standard of professional appearance. That's not from a car accident either. That's from an IED, an improvised explosive device that took out her entire Green Beret team during a high-value target extraction. She was the sole survivor, blown 20 feet from the vehicle, riddled with shrapnel, with a punctured lung." He took a deep, pained breath, his eyes locking with Ilara's. She stood beside him, her face a pale, stoic mask, but her eyes glistened with unshed tears. The memories he was unearthing raw and visceral. "She should have been dead," Thorne said, his voice thick with emotion. "But she wasn't. She dragged herself over to me. I was bleeding out from a piece of shrapnel that had severed an artery in my leg, and she held that artery closed with her bare hands. For 3 hours. 3 hours we were pinned down, waiting for evac. She held on, losing her own blood, talking to me, keeping me conscious, keeping 2 other wounded men calm, all while she was in more pain than any of you can possibly imagine. Those scars, you pompous, arrogant little man," he spat, his eyes blazing at Dr. Croft, "were earned. They were paid for in blood and courage. They are medals of honor that she wears on her skin, and they are the reason that I and at least a dozen other men are alive today. She is not just the best medic I have ever seen. She is the finest soldier I have ever had the privilege of serving with." The monologue was devastating. It was a verbal hydrogen bomb detonated in the sterile confines of the emergency room. Dr. Adrian Croft's carefully constructed world of prestige and authority had been vaporized in an instant. His face, which had been pale, was now a mottled, sickly red. He looked around at the faces of his staff, the interns, the residents, the nurses, and saw nothing but pure, undiluted contempt. He had mocked a hero. He had belittled the savior of the very man he was trying to use to advance his own career. His ruin was absolute, public, and exquisitely complete. Mr. Harris, the administrator, was looking at him with the cold, dead eyes of a man already calculating the cost of a severance package and a public relations nightmare. The elevator doors dinged open. The spell was broken. A stunned silence was followed by a spontaneous, thunderous ovation. It started with one of the young nurses clapping slowly, her eyes filled with tears. Then others joined in. The paramedics, the security guards, the residents. It was a wave of sound, a raw, emotional tribute to the quiet woman who had walked among them as a ghost and was now revealed to be a giant. They were not just clapping for her, they were clapping for the justice they had just witnessed, for the cathartic downfall of a petty tyrant and the vindication of a true hero. Ilara, her composure finally breaking, squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, overwhelmed. She gave a short, sharp nod to the crowd, an acknowledgement that was both grateful and deeply uncomfortable. Her work was not for applause. It had never been. She stepped into the elevator with the gurney, her focus already back on the man whose life was still in her hands. The doors slid shut, leaving Dr. Croft alone in the hallway, engulfed by the sound of her acclaim and the deafening silence of his own disgrace. After handing off Colonel Thorne to the waiting trauma surgery team, with a detailed, precise report, that left the senior surgeon nodding in impressed respect, Ilara retreated to a small empty supply closet. The adrenaline that had surged through her was beginning to fade, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep weariness. The carefully built walls that had protected her for 5 years had been leveled. Captain Vance was back, and she did not know if she could put that ghost back in its grave. She was splashing cold water on her face in the staff locker room when 2 men in dark conservative suits entered. They were flanked by 2 uniformed military police officers. They were not hospital staff. They had the hard, watchful eyes of federal agents or military intelligence. The older of the 2 men stepped forward. "Captain Vance?" he asked, his voice polite but firm. "My name is Deputy Secretary Miller, David Miller." He gestured to his leg. "I owe you a debt that can never be repaid. The colonel made a call as soon as he was stable enough. He told us where to find you." The name hit her. Sergeant First Class David Miller, the medic she had saved in the Humvee. He was older now, the boyish face she remembered replaced by the distinguished look of a senior government official, but the grateful, reverent look in his eyes was the same. Her past was not just returning, it was coming to collect her. "We've been looking for you for a long time, Captain," Miller said gently. "After you were medically discharged, you just disappeared. There are a lot of people who want to thank you, the President included." He paused. "There is a place for you, a place where your skills are needed, where you won't have to hide who you are. Colonel Thorne's first request upon waking up from surgery was that I come here personally and bring you home." Ilara looked at her reflection in the locker mirror. She saw the tired eyes, the faint lines of stress, the woman who had tried so desperately to be ordinary. But she also saw the shadow of the person she had been, the leader, the warrior, the protector. She had run from that life, believing she could find peace in quiet service. But the world, it seemed, had other plans. Her purpose was not to hide her scars, but to use the strength they represented. She took a deep breath, the sterile hospital air filling her lungs one last time. She nodded slowly. "All right," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "Let's go home." She did not bother to say goodbye to anyone. She simply took off her scrubs, folded them neatly, and left them in her locker. Dressed in her simple street clothes, she walked out of the hospital, flanked by the men who represented the world she had left behind. She did not look back. As she stepped out into the crisp evening air, she felt a profound sense of release, the shedding of a skin that no longer fit. Her war was not over. It had just been waiting for her to return. The story of what happened in Trauma Bay 1 that day became the stuff of legend at Metropolitan General. Dr. Adrian Croft was quietly and unceremoniously dismissed the following morning, his career in medicine effectively over. The tale was told and retold, a cautionary fable about the dangers of arrogance and a testament to the quiet, unassuming heroes who walk among us every day. They say that true strength is not the absence of scars, but the courage to bear them, to own them as a testament to the battles you have fought and won. Ilara Vance had never seen herself as a hero. She saw herself as a survivor. But sometimes, in a world full of noise and posturing, the greatest act of heroism is simply to survive, and to be ready when the call comes again.